Hello everyone and welcome back to Critique Clinic, the video series where we give our patrons and you advice on how you can improve your miniature painting.
We've got some great miniatures to have a look at this week, so let's jump straight in.
Okay, first up we've got Bohemian Knights, a bit of a returning fan favourite here.
The man with the goose.
So we gave Bohemian Knights some feedback on a previous episode for one of their lieutenants that they'd painted and converted with like one of the geese models.
That's amazing.
Really fun model. The main feedback that we gave was on the black armor. We said about implementing the sort of heavy metal style chunky highlight. And most importantly, going brighter on the high spots, so like a second or third stage corner dot highlight. And they've said that they've taken that on board and they've tried to apply it with this model.
Wow, I mean, I've got to say, right from the get-go, the improvement from the first miniature to this one is, like, absolutely amazing. And, like, I really, really sincerely mean that. Like, you've done amazing at, like, the refinement and also, like, the saturation, the colours and things like that. You've done really, really good. So you should be really, really proud of that model.
You can see a massive improvement in brush control, particularly with the highlights and the refinement and the sort of sharpness of the edge highlights. And it's really nice to see as well you're taking the feedback on board with the sort of second and third stage brighter highlights. So we can start to see that here with like the top of the tilt shield and on sort of the high points on some of the shin plates around here. You can see it on the sort of knuckles there as well. And on the top as well. Do
you know one of my favourite things? I think one of the things I like the most is actually just the use of colour as well. Like, I love the fact that you've gone like for a really, really desaturated, almost like military green for like all the webbing and the bandolier and that kind of stuff. And then like for the attention grabbing sort of like main contrast, you've gone for that vibrant red. I know I'm biased on that colour, but like, but it just works really well with the scheme. And like, I
think a pop of colour like that on a like otherwise monochromatic colour scheme with just black and white, like adding those little flavours of colour, I think adds massive amounts of value.
Oh yeah, 100%. Yeah, and like, it's just really great choices with colour. Like, and even the way you balanced it then by then sort of using a desaturated or much darker blue for like the gun casing on the grav gun on the shoulder, obviously the cape as well. I just think it's really, really good. The other thing to talk about, your base on your first model was really great. Obviously, it had a geese on it. Let's get that out there for start off with. But using vibrant sort of bright green tufts to contrast the bright red as well, I think that's a really great choice. Again, you one thing that we always talk about with miniatures is basing, and like basing is like the frame of a canvas or a painting, and like having a really good base to go with a model that also complements and works with the miniature is just a really good way to make a project stand out massively more. And like, you've done great with that as well.
Yeah. So with all that improvement in mind, let's get a little bit nitty gritty. Just a couple of little further refinement points. For me, I think perhaps the way that the Aquila has been highlighted isn't necessarily my favourite way to go about this. No. So with white, I think shading with black is a bit too harsh for me. I would have gone with like a soft grey or maybe even like slightly off blue tones, like blue horror, things like that.
Thunderhawk blue is really good. So that's a great colour to use.
I would have gone for like an all-over base coat of white as a starting point, and then gone in and shaded softly over the top with some softer tones, rather than what looks to be here done as starting with the black and then picking out with the white and sort of leaving those bits behind.
It's you got to think it's so much easier to add shadow and tone to a light object rather than brighten a dark object. You've got to put way more paint on that surface to lighten it to where you want it to be bright. You're literally going from the darkest colour to the brightest colour on that Aquila. So like, start a lot lighter, block it in with a slightly desaturated white, shade it softly and maybe with some deeper points, obviously with like some slightly darker blues or greys or whatever, and then do your final light like colour, like with the brightest white you got. You know, a lot of people make the mistake of going too bright with white when you start. Like, you got to paint it white, so you paint it really bright. Don't do that. Go like slightly dark, desaturated, like a grey steel,
slightly
or
off
something
white,
like that. And then that's great to sort of highlight up.
And I think as well, in like, I hate to draw real life references because these are, you know, tiny miniatures of spacemen, but typically in real world reference, you're never really going to see a black shadow kind of on anything, but especially white, because it's just so reflective. Some other little key details as well, I think, could just be picked out just for some visual interest. There's some little rivets on the tilt shield. Personally, I like a metallic highlight on those. But if you want to go for the armor colors to say it's like painted, then I would go the same sort of edge highlight color that you've done here on the actual edges of it. And then also as well, just a little...
I noticed this and I wanted to talk about this as well. It looks like, I mean, fair point, and I've got to give you kudos for using an OG bolt pistol because that's great. I think you just need to do a bit better clean up on it. If you look at the top here, for example, there's some like file marks and something on here. The barrel, again, I'm a stickler for it. You know me and George are big barrel drillers. I try and get it centered. Again, like just just doing a notch with a knife right in the middle first, and then using that notch to guide the drill part, or whether you're using a pin vise or hand drill, whatever you want to use. There's a little bit of overspill of the blue from the lens underneath the barrel here onto the left of it.
A little bit of a mould line.
And there's a little bit of a mould line. As I said, like these older parts, they're still really, really great, and they work really well on miniatures, and I'm glad you've used one. Because the moulding back then wasn't as good as the newer plastics, I think you just need a little bit more care and time on those parts to just bring them up to sort of like the cleanliness of the rest of the miniature.
Yeah, but overall, absolutely massive improvement. Fantastic piece. We'll look forward to seeing what you do taking this on in the future as well. Okay, next up, we've got Swiss War Painter, who has painted a Custodes Blade Champion.
So yeah, a fantastic miniature, really, really dynamic pose with that charging sort of look is great. I think when I first saw the miniature, there was a few little things which stood out. Overall, I think it's really, really well painted, and there's some really nice things that you've done on there. We're a big stickler for it, but unfortunately there is the sort of mould line here on the bottom of the sword that you can see. So that's just a tiny little one that's there. Catching the light, it just makes it instantly visible. Quick skim with a knife, that will come off, and then you can just repaint that. The thing for me that I kind of like wanted to touch upon was sort of like the armour. So it looks like potentially this has been dry brushed, which I think that there's nothing wrong with that at all whatsoever, just to caveat this. But I think obviously just where the armour is supposed to be black in some areas, the speckled kind of like gold here kind of doesn't make it read as if it's either black or gold. It kind of like gets lost in translation, so to speak.
I think it doesn't perfectly segment the colours as well, because if we've got, for example, a piece on the trim here, which I believe is supposed to be gold, and then this inner plate is supposed to be black, because there's a lot of black still showing on the trim.
Exactly, it's
harder to sort of define those key elements of the model. One thing we talk about often is a miniature with fewer techniques applied that's like overall simpler. If it's blocked in nice and neat and it's very, very visually clear what each detail is supposed to be, often that can read a bit better.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah. So I think that's the only thing that for me was a little bit confusing. And I think, obviously, if that's as I said, you said you're trying to get 10,000 points done, which is obviously a lot of models. I understand, like, totally, if you're trying to sort of like do things as quickly as possible. But like George has said, I think if you just pick a key amount of fundamental things to just absolutely nail perfectly.
And I think you're definitely clearly capable of doing that, because if we look from the sort of waist down at the cloth and the leather and all the other details on the model, everything's really, really nicely blocked in. It's really, really cleanly painted. So I think that as well kind of makes this a little bit of a juxtaposition of you've got really, really nicely, smoothly, clearly blocked in areas with some nice clean highlights. And then the gold just look like the painting style's kind of different.
Yeah, because it doesn't have an edge on it. So like if like you've got all this lovely edge work that you've done on like the cloth and boots, the leather, like all those things, and then the other parts of it don't have that. So it kind of, again, it's kind of conflicting with the other parts of the model.
Yeah. One thing I do really like is the base. I'll stick on some of the other photos, but there's a really, really nice sort of like marble texture that's been done.
Yeah, it looks great.
Which I think looks really, really convincing and really nice. It sort of frames the model in. You can like imagine him in like a
palace or something.
Or something like that. Yeah.
The other thing which sort of stood out for us when we were looking at the miniature was the face. I think that what you've done was in the section of it, I think it looks good, as in like the hair being white to the face, add contrast to the rest of the model. I think the colour choices are good. I do think that there's like some grey marks on the face, and obviously it looks that like potentially like a wash has been applied just over like a flesh tone potentially, or it might be like a contrast paint that's been put over. Again, there's nothing wrong with doing it that way, but I think that just maybe not allowing it to pull so heavily in areas potentially could be a better thing.
I think maybe it's even just not necessarily down to technique and application, it's just sort of overall colour choice, because I'm seeing a lot of like you said, grey and sort of other tones in here. None of this really reads as like an ideal skin tone for me.
It's very mottled. It could, you know what, I'm going to give the painter the benefit. That could be like soot and stuff.
Yeah, for sure.
It could be something like that.
That's perfectly fair. It's just an opinionated statement, obviously.
Correct,
but for me personally, I would have gone like paler, pinker, softer red tones for skin, especially like Caucasian flesh. You can go like quite like white almost, whereas this has got sort of these sort of orangey sort of tones in the shadows, but then like you said, this sort of like grey colours. I'm not sure if that's potentially like from painting the hair or if that's a wash or something like that. I'm not entirely sure why that's there. But for me, I think the face is one of the focal points of any miniature you're painting. And for me personally, I would much rather spend or you spend loads of time on the face and not a lot of time elsewhere, because I think that will add more overall. It's like that. I think Miniac coined the phrase like don't waste time painting the boots.
Yeah, exactly.
It's like we're not spending a lot of time looking down here at like the feet and the sort of lesser important parts of the model.
No.
But the face is something that like as a human you're instantly your eyes drawn to. And if it's an overthought or like it's a little bit of an oversight and there's less effort spent there because you're perhaps enjoying painting the rest of the model, maybe you don't enjoy painting faces or you don't feel like you're great at it, I think it's definitely somewhere that you should be spending more time. And if you're not comfortable with it yet, spend more time practicing. Typically, kits come with a lot of extra heads, so they're nice to just keep around and just paint for practice. I think it'll really improve your model. Okay, last but by certainly no means least, we have BK.
Bobby G in the house.
It says, hey folks, I did this fella a few months back, maybe even half a year, but it's my last display attempt, for lack of a better description. A bit of context for the feedback. I wanted to do an entry for Monty Sansovino standard category. Unfortunately, I couldn't fit it in the schedule. In certain angles, he looks like he has a lazy eye, but I really didn't want to redo them and risk having to do the eyelids or other parts of the face, especially after I knew I wouldn't enter him. I tried to have him casting a shadow on the base, and the plinth is just what I had on hand, should be changed for a competition as well. Colour-wise, I wanted to go bright, Warcraft Alliance-like for the gold. First thing for me with this, the basing, like textures, like really to me does read like sort of like limestone, marble sort of.
I think it's great.
It looks great.
I love the colour as well.
Really convincing.
Yeah. I've got to say, I said this to George just before we started. Like, I think the bit before the banner pole, in the back bit, it's the most realistic brick I've ever seen on a model that's been submitted to critique. It looks great. It looks great. Like really reads really well. So
this is obviously painted in a sort of non-metallic, more like artsy competition, painterly style. So I think we'll bear that in mind, like with the feedback.
Yep.
Do you want to open up the sort of the NMM?
Yeah, I mean, I think the non-metallics, the colours are really nice. I think you've done a great job with it. I think there's a little bit of discrepancy in sort of like lighting in some areas, like across the model, and we'll talk about that a bit more. But I think overall the non-metallics read really well. They read like gold, which is nice.
Definitely looks like gold. There's no doubt in my mind about that.
Yeah,
so that's a great starting point.
Especially like on the van brace on the forearm, you got that lovely kind of like almost like bangle part of the armour just before the wrist.
I actually really liked as well, just sort of this angle of the sort of shoulder pad trim.
Yeah.
Really nice as well.
I thought that was really cool. But yeah, no, it reads really nicely. I think the colours and the variance of colours is really good that's been used. So yeah, absolutely brilliant.
I think in terms of the blue, so obviously it's a slightly different sort of, I don't say non-metallic effect, but it's sort of like the volumetric highlighting style in a similar vein.
Yep.
For me, there's a little bit of inconsistency in the sort of brightness. So if the brightest spot immediately is this sort of part of the top of the hand, which means that my eye is instantly drawn to his hand.
Yeah,
I don't
100%.
think that that's the most interesting part of this miniature at all. That aside from it sort of drawing my eye over here, just in terms of overall consistency, I don't know why the sort of top of the power pack and the upper parts of some of the chest and ab armor and the toes, etc. I don't know why they're not as bright as this.
No, it doesn't. It doesn't read as if light is hitting it the same everywhere, if that makes sense, because you've got that point on the especially, and there's also a married point. So if you have a look at the again at the wrist with a sword on the van brace, there's a bloom highlight that's been done on the upper apex of the curve of that panel as well. So I think because you've got those 2 points that read as bright points, it would also make sense to me that the backpack, the exhaust ports left and right of the head, and that those blooms on there, if you put blooms on there, they'd actually frame the head a little bit as well, so your eye will be drawn to those blooms, which would also help with being drawn to the face as well, which is good. So I think that's the main feedback I give. The thing that does conflict as well is obviously if you look at the Iron Halo, the bright point where you put it is in the center, and it radiates outward from that point. And again, there's no reason why the exhaust ports wouldn't have blooms that would also radiate outward to kind of unify and marry to the point that light's hitting the Iron Halo a certain way, if that makes sense.
In terms of the gold, it's clear that the sort of light point is like directly from above. Yeah. Sort of that nice sort of zenith point. Whereas with the armor, it's a little bit all over the place, being honest, just in terms of like where light is hitting it from and how that reads. Yeah. I think there is perhaps a time and a place for doing like some bright spots to draw the eye. But to me, that doesn't really read as intentional because, like I said, the hand isn't really the focal point of this sculpt.
No, but then things like, for example, the individual fingers on the power fist, like the top one would be brighter, and then what I would have done is I would have gone darker away from that bright point because it's like at the angle, light would radiate down it. So like, there's just little things that are sending mixed messages a little bit, and that's the only feedback that I think. Like, I think the execution's great. I think the saturation's really nice. I think all those things are great. For me, the biggest thing that I, aside from all the things I've said, I like for example the base, the brick, and all the other bits and bobs that you've done. I think the leather doesn't read as leather. Being honest with you, I think that like I see what you've done with it, and again, there's no other kind of like weathering on other areas of the miniature. But I always say this, like, Your job as a painter is to trick the eye. That model is resin or plastic or metal. It's to trick the eye to make the perceiver read that material as that material. And I just think for me, the leather doesn't read as leather because it hasn't got, if you think of where it is, it's hanging obviously like in his midriff, obviously down from the shoulders. It's going to be rubbing. It's going to have wear and a little bit of like damage or character or personality. It probably wouldn't be new leather that he's just strapped on for that sword holding aloft moment, you know what I mean?
I think there is some like texture that's been painted on, but I think it's maybe just a lack of contrast because the distance between the brightest highlight and the darkest shadow is quite
close,
minimal, to be honest.
Yeah.
I would have gone for some like much lighter browns and like ochres and things like that, just to pick out some of the high points and little scratches and like ruffles and things like that. I think that would have added a little bit. I do agree. Overall, it's a really nice display piece, though. Like I said, it's really flame nicely. Like his Horus Heresy characters are really fun to paint.
Yeah.
The non-metallic gold is fantastic. The stonework is fantastic, and like you said, even down to the technique of how the blue has been painted is absolutely fine.
Yeah,
I think just maybe considering on future miniatures the sort of continuity of the light, I think would make a big improvement.
Yeah, definitely.
Okay, well, on that note, a massive thank you to all of our patrons for submitting for this week's episode of Critique Clinic. If you would like to feature on a future episode and get some feedback from myself and James, then check the link in the description of this episode. You'll find a link to our Patreon. And in addition to that, you'll find hundreds of high-quality PDF and video tutorials on a range of techniques. We've also got character masterclasses on there. It's updated every single week, and you'll also get some cool podcast bonus benefits as well. So check that out. Otherwise, we will see you next week.
See you very soon. Take care.